War is often remembered by battles, by dates, by flags raised and cities lost. But wars are not fought only by soldiers. They are fought by mothers who learn to smile while letting their children go, by women who wait for letters and fear the silence more than the gunfire. This is not a story about heroism on the battlefield. It is a story about a mother who followed the war because her son was there. She did not carry a rifle. She carried bandages, trembling hands, and a heart that refused to stop loving. This is the story of an American mother who became a frontline nurse, not for glory, not for recognition, but for one reason only. Because somewhere in the chaos of war, her child was fighting to stay alive. When the war began, America spoke in numbers. Troops deployed, ships launched, casualties reported. But for one American mother, the war was never about strategy or victory. It was about a single name, written in careful handwriting at the bottom of a letter. Love your son. Her name was Margaret Hale. She was a widow from a quiet town in Ohio. Her hands had known only kitchens, laundry water, and the warmth of a child's fevered forehead. Her son, Thomas, was 19 when the letter arrived. The draft notice was folded neatly, almost politely. It asked for his youth. It asked for his future. And it asked his mother to let him go. She smiled when she hugged him goodbye. Mothers often do. But that night, alone in the kitchen, Margaret pressed her face into his empty jacket and wept without sound. Thomas was sent overseas. Margaret stayed behind, waiting for letters the way some people wait for air. At first, they came regularly. He wrote about training, about the noise, about missing home. He tried to reassure her. Then the letters changed. They grew shorter, the handwriting tighter. He stopped describing his days. And then, 1 month, no letter came at all. Margaret went to the post office every morning. The clerk learned her name without asking. Still, nothing. That was when she made the decision that would change everything. Margaret was 42 years old. Too old, they said. A mother, they reminded her. But she did not argue. She enrolled in a wartime nursing program and trained until her fingers cracked and her back ached. She learned how to stop bleeding, how to stitch torn flesh, how to look into the eyes of boys younger than her son and not break. She did not tell anyone her real reason, but in her heart, she knew. If she could not protect her son at home, she would protect someone's son at the front. The field hospital was nothing like the photographs. There were no clean white sheets, only mud, blood, and the sound of men calling for their mothers. Margaret worked 16-hour days. She washed wounds that would never heal. She held hands as life slipped away. She whispered comfort to soldiers who spoke her son's name by mistake. Every night, she searched the incoming lists. Every face made her heart stop. Then, one afternoon, she saw him. Thomas was carried in on a stretcher, unconscious, pale, barely breathing. She did not scream. She did not run. She became a nurse. Her hands moved with impossible calm as she cleaned his wounds, as she stayed beside him through the night, counting every breath. She did not tell him who she was. Not yet. Thomas woke days later, confused, weak, alive. He looked at the nurse who never left his side and frowned. "You remind me of my mother," he whispered. Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that costs something. "I know," she said softly. Only when he was strong enough did she tell him the truth. Thomas cried, not because of pain, but because, even here, even in war, his mother had found him. Margaret stayed until the war ended. She never asked to go home early. She never asked for recognition. When asked why she volunteered so late in life, she answered simply, "Because my son was there, and because every wounded soldier is someone's child." When peace finally came, Margaret returned home quieter than before. Her hands never forgot what they had held. And sometimes, when letters arrived from men she once nursed, men who lived because she stood between them and death, she sits at her kitchen table and reads them slowly. The war took many things from her, but it did not take her love, and it did not take her son. The field hospital did not sleep. It breathed. At night, it breathed in pain and breathed out silence. Margaret learned this quickly. The canvas walls shook with artillery in the distance. The ground trembled, not enough to knock you down, just enough to remind you that death was nearby and patient. Her hands were never clean anymore. No matter how often she washed them, the smell stayed. Metal, smoke, blood. She stopped noticing it after the first month. What she could never stop noticing were the faces. Young men, too young. Boys who still carried photographs of sweethearts folded carefully in their pockets. Boys who cried out for their mothers in the dark, even when they had not spoken her name in years. Margaret answered them all. Sometimes she lied. "You're going to be fine," she said, knowing they would not last the night. She learned that hope was sometimes more merciful than truth. Other times, she said nothing at all, just held their hands while life slipped away, feeling the moment when the grip loosened and the body became suddenly lighter. That moment never got easier. The work was relentless. Shelling did not wait for exhaustion. Wounds did not pause for grief. Margaret learned to move without thinking. She cut away uniforms stiff with dried blood. She pressed cloth into wounds that would never fully close. She listened to men confess things they had never told anyone, regrets, fears, names of people they would never see again. She memorized the sound of dying, a shallow breath, a pause too long, then nothing. At night, when she finally sat down, her hands trembled so badly she could barely hold her cup. She told herself she was strong. She had to be. Because somewhere on this same continent, her son was breathing the same air, facing the same dangers. And she needed to be strong enough for both of them. Sometimes, soldiers asked her why she volunteered. "You're old enough to be home," one said gently, his voice already fading. Margaret smiled. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she answered. She never said the truth, that every time she cleaned a wound, she imagined it was her son's, that every life she saved felt like a small defiance against the war. If she could not save Thomas from the world, she would save the world from losing every Thomas. As the months passed, the hospital grew more crowded. The battles intensified. The injuries became worse. Men arrived missing pieces of themselves, arms, legs, futures. Margaret learned to look at what remained, not what was gone. She learned how to help men sit up when they realized they would never walk again. How to listen when they asked, in small, frightened voices, whether anyone would still love them. Sometimes she had no answers. She stayed anyway. Then came the day the wounded arrived faster than they could be treated. Stretchers lined the ground outside the hospital. The cries overlapped until they became one continuous sound. Margaret worked until her vision blurred. She did not realize she was bleeding until another nurse grabbed her wrist. "Margaret," she said sharply, "you're hurt." Margaret looked down. A deep cut ran across her palm, opened by shattered glass hours earlier. She stared at it for a moment, surprised. Then she pulled her hand free. "I'm fine," she said. She wrapped it quickly and kept going. There were still men waiting. That night, she dreamed of her son. He was standing in their old kitchen, whole and smiling. He asked her why she looked so tired. She woke with tears soaking her pillow and did not bother wiping them away. The letter came 3 weeks later. Not from Thomas, from the War Department. Margaret recognized the envelope immediately. She sat on the edge of her cot and held it without opening it, feeling the weight of it in her hands. Around her, the hospital moved on. Men shouted. Orders were called. The world did not pause. She opened the letter slowly. It said that Private Thomas Hale had been killed in action. It did not say how. It did not say when exactly. It thanked her for her sacrifice. Margaret folded the letter neatly and placed it beside her bed. Then she stood up and went back to work. She did not scream. She did not collapse. She did not tell anyone. For days, she functioned on something colder than grief. She cleaned wounds. She whispered comfort. Inside her, something hollowed out and stayed empty. She began to avoid looking too closely at the incoming bodies. But fate has a cruel sense of timing. It happened during a transport from the front. The casualties arrived in silence. Too many. Too still. Margaret was helping unload stretchers when she saw the tag. The name. She knew it before her mind allowed her to understand it. Thomas Hale. Her son. The world tilted. For the first time since she arrived at the front, Margaret froze. Another nurse touched her arm. "Margaret." She shook her head slightly, as if clearing water from her ears. "I'll take this one," she said. Her voice did not sound like her own. The body on the stretcher was covered. Margaret walked beside it as if escorting a stranger. Inside the tent, she closed the flap herself. Her hands hesitated. Then, slowly, she pulled back the covering. What remained of her son lay before her. He was not whole. The uniform was torn, burned in places. One side of his body was still, unnaturally so. His face, what remained untouched, was peaceful, almost like sleep. Margaret reached out and touched his hair. It was still his. That small detail shattered her. She did not cry loudly. She made no sound at all. She pressed her forehead against his and breathed, once, twice. "I'm here," she whispered, even though it was far too late. In that moment, she was not a nurse. She was only a mother. A mother who had followed the war across an ocean, only to arrive just in time to say goodbye. Margaret stayed with him longer than was allowed. Outside the tent, the war continued its rhythm. Orders were shouted. Engines roared. Men laughed. Somewhere, impossibly, someone laughed. Inside, time stood still. She cleaned what wounds she could, not because it mattered anymore, but because this was the last way she knew how to love him. Her hands moved gently, reverently. The same hands that had washed his face when he was a child. The same hands that had buttoned his coat on winter mornings. She spoke to him softly, telling him things that no one else needed to hear. That she was proud. That he had been brave. That he had never been alone. When she was finished, she closed his eyes. That was the moment her hands finally began to shake. The burial was small. There was no coffin, only a simple wrapping and a shallow grave marked with a wooden cross. Margaret stood apart from the others. She did not wear black. She wore the same stained uniform she had worn for months. When the chaplain spoke of sacrifice and honor, The words drifted past her without meaning. She watched the dirt fall. Each sound felt final. When it was over, she knelt briefly, pressed her palm to the earth, and stood up. There were still wounded men waiting. She returned to work the next morning. Not because she was strong, but because stopping would mean feeling everything at once. Now, every soldier's face carried traces of her son, a familiar smile, a curve of the jaw, the same age. She began to work longer hours. She volunteered for the worst cases. Pain, she discovered, was easier to manage when it belonged to someone else. At night, sleep became impossible. When she did sleep, she dreamed of Thomas calling her name from somewhere she could not reach. Sometimes, she woke screaming. Other times, she woke calm, convinced for a brief, merciful moment that none of it had happened. Then the weight returned. When the war finally ended, Margaret did not celebrate. She packed her few belongings and boarded a transport ship in silence. America welcomed her home as a hero. She accepted the handshake, the certificate, the polite applause. No one asked her what it felt like to bury her child in foreign soil, and she did not volunteer the answer. Home was smaller than she remembered. The house was too quiet. Thomas's room remained exactly as he had left it. Margaret stood in the doorway for a long time, unable to cross the threshold. Eventually, she began to sit there at night, listening to the silence. People told her she should move on, that she had done her duty. That time would heal. She smiled and nodded. But time did not heal. Time only made the memories sharper. She kept nursing, at a local hospital, at community clinics, anywhere that needed hands. She treated strangers with the same care she had given soldiers. Sometimes, when she adjusted a blanket or wiped a fevered forehead, her chest tightened with a familiar ache. But she never stopped, because nursing had become the only language she had left. Years later, a letter arrived. It was from a man she barely remembered, a soldier she had once treated. He wrote to tell her he had lived, that he had married, that he had named his son Thomas. Margaret read the letter slowly. She pressed it against her chest and cried, not loudly, but deeply, the way grief settles when it has nowhere else to go. Margaret Hale lived a long life. She never remarried. She never spoke much of the war. But in her small living room, on a shelf by the window, there was a photograph. A young man in uniform, smiling. Visitors sometimes asked who he was. Margaret would pause, then answer quietly, "My son." Nothing more, nothing less. When she died, they found among her belongings a folded piece of paper. It was a list of names, dozens of them. Soldiers she had helped, men who had survived. At the bottom, written carefully, was one final name, Thomas Hale. The war took her child, but it did not take her purpose, and in every life she saved, in every hand she held, a part of her son lived on. When wars end, history moves on. Borders are redrawn, medals are awarded, speeches are made. But some battles never truly end. They continue in quiet kitchens, in empty bedrooms, in the hands of mothers who never stop remembering how it felt to hold their child for the last time. Margaret Hale saved many lives, but she could not save the one she loved most. And yet, her story is not only about loss. It is about a love so powerful that it crossed oceans, battlefields, and fear itself. Because sometimes, the greatest acts of courage are not written in history books. They live quietly in the hearts of mothers who chose love even when the world chose war.